Hi, I'm Jonathan Tomkin from the University of Illinois. The Earth is made up of a lot of interconnected systems, and as we saw in the last series of lectures, a lot of these systems are being changed by human activity. Systems as diverse as the air, the land, the water, and all their components, the natural systems and the human systems in them. A lot of these systems are facing problems. They're being degraded, they're being used in ways that aren't sustainable. And it turns out that there is unifying concepts that can be used to link these very disparate systems. So we can use a similar idea to understand why the air is being polluted as to why we're overfishing the oceans. So in this series of lectures, we'll look at examples of this and try and see if there are any solutions. So we can all think of many examples of these sorts of degradations. We can think of light pollution, smog pollution, as in this figure here. One idea that unites all of these is the so-called tragedy of the commons. This idea was first brought forward by Garrett Hardin in 1968, and it referred explicitly to common lands, and that is land that is shared by a group of people, so no one person owns it. And historically, a commons is a place where farmers would get fodder for their herds, so there'd be pasture lands. But we can also use this idea metaphorically. So we can talk about the commons being an ocean, a forest, or even the atmosphere. And we can also use this idea in this case to find that the same issues crop up. The tragedy of the commons, as it applies to pastures, can also be used to explain much broader, bigger things. So if the commons is a pasture land, why is it also a tragedy? The tragedy refers to its inevitable destruction, and that's why it's known as tragic and not, say, unfortunate or unlucky. This land is destined to be doomed because the system means that there is no way that we can save it. So a tragedy of the commons means that we're on an inevitable path to destruction. The idea behind the commons is, what if we overgraze a commons? What if we put too many animals on it? Well, this has happened in many places around the world, and when this happens, we see the plants get stripped, the soil is exposed, we get a loss of topsoil, and in many cases we actually destroy the value of the land. It can no longer regrow, it cannot regenerate, so it's not sustainable. So the tragedy is that the system inevitably leads to its destruction. How does that system work? Well, let's imagine that we have one set of commons. So we have one set of land, one pasture land, with multiple farmers hosting their sheep or cows or whatever their pasture animals are. How do they interact with one another in deciding how to use this resource? Let's imagine the case where you only have one cow, but some of your neighbours have 2 or 3 cows. Is it fair that you're only using a fraction of the resource compared to your neighbours? No, it's not fair. So your incentive is to add a cow so that you have as many cattle grazing as your compatriots do. And when you think in a lot of subsistence societies, an extra cow can make an enormous difference. It can mean that your children are no longer malnourished, or it can mean that you can get an education. There's a lot of incentive to add that extra cow. The problem is that this way of thinking is true for everybody. So if you want to add a cow, so does the other farmers. And if everybody adds a cow, what happens? We overgraze the resource. So the individual incentive doesn't match up with the needs for the group. If we take a numerical example, imagine this. Imagine there are 100 cows on this plot of land. If you add 1 cow, that's only burdening the resource by 1%. So that's a tiny change. Whereas if you're doubling the number of cows because you're going from 1 cow to 2 cows, you're doubling the amount of resources you're extracting from this resource. So clearly your incentive is to add that extra cow. But again, that thinking can apply to everybody. So if everybody thinks I add 1 cow, it makes a tiny little difference to the resource from my point of view, but it doubles my return, I should do that. And if everybody does that, we double the total number of cows. And instead of having a small change to the resource use, we have an enormous change. And that enormous change can be a tragedy because we can destroy the resource. So note that in the long run, nobody wants to destroy this resource. But there doesn't seem to be any way to get from the short-run needs of the individual to the long-run needs of the group as a whole. Wikipedia has a definition. Multiple individuals acting independently and solely and rationally consulting their own self-interest will ultimately deplete a shared limited resource even when it is clear that it is not in anyone's long-term interest for this to happen. The tragedy of this system, as you'll get from the readings, is that there doesn't appear to be a way to stop this. Every individual needs to do what is best for them, but when they do that, they destroy the resource, and in the long run, everybody suffers. So that's the case for a commons. If we were just worried about rangeland, it would be a very limited problem. But this tragedy of the commons acts as a metaphor to explain many other different systems. What else do we hold in common? Well, one example is we hold the atmosphere in common. Every individual on Earth breathes the same atmosphere. And so we all face the same incentives. We want to use the atmosphere for ourselves, but if we damage the atmosphere, that is shared amongst everybody else. So the atmosphere as a commons resource might be vulnerable to a tragedy. Similarly, the oceans around the world are all connected. No one person or one city or one country owns the oceans. And so it's a shared resource. And again, each individual, each country might have its own interests, but they might not be compatible with the group long-term interests. Global fisheries are perhaps the strongest evidence that this metaphor works. Fisheries around the world are shared. Often fish don't stay in one local waters, they move from place to place, or they're in international waters where no one country claims sovereignty. So this means that in principle, fish stocks are a common resource, open to all, and so therefore there is individual incentives for each fisherman or each fishing fleet from each country to collect as many of this resource for themselves as they can. Coupling this with increased technology, we have bigger boats, better imaging systems, we're able to find shoals in ways that wasn't imaginable even 20 years ago. Humans have been able to fish in places they've never been able to fish before. As a consequence, fish stocks are suffering. This has been observed in fisheries all over the world, but I'm going to concentrate on the Northern Atlantic. As you can see from this figure, fish stocks have declined markedly in the last few decades. The amount caught by fishermen is lower despite all of these advanced technologies and bigger boats. The reason is there was an expansion in the 50s and 60s which wiped out cod stocks. This meant there weren't enough fish left to reproduce, and so a sustainable resource was destroyed. And it's not clear when cod stocks will return, if ever they will, to their previous level. People in the United States know as Maine as a place where fishermen bring in a lot of lobster. And one of the reasons that it's become such a centre for lobster is that lobster's natural predator, the cod, has all but been wiped out. And this pattern is not restricted to the Northern Atlantic. We see this all around the world. In this figure you can see different colours denoting how fish stocks are being used. As we can see, there's been a big change from 60 years ago to today. In the past, there was a lot of undeveloped fish stocks, whereas today, fully half of all fish stocks are at capacity. That is, there's no room for increasing withdrawals of fish without risking this runaway destruction of the fishery. Another 50% of the fisheries are either overfished or have already collapsed. So as we can see, fish stocks around the world have been victims of this tragedy of the commons. Individual fishermen don't want these fish stocks to disappear, but their own incentive is to catch as many fish as they can, and because everybody else's incentive is the same, the fish are overused, we overfish the stock, and they collapse. Another very important issue that might be a tragedy of the commons is greenhouse warming. We all share the atmosphere. Every individual has incentive to use cheap fossil fuels. It creates power, it has high energy density. We'll spend more time talking about it in a later class. But the problem is it creates a pollution. And this pollution is changing the atmosphere. While the carbon dioxide produced damages the atmosphere as a whole, any one person's contribution is infinitesimal. So for each of us, if we produce this pollution, we're not hurting ourselves very much at all, and we're getting all the benefits of using that cheap fossil fuel. But of course, collectively, this means that we can change the climate. So this is another example of the commons, in this case the atmosphere, potentially being on a tragic path because the individual interest is different from the group collective interest. So does that mean that we're all doomed? That we can't solve these problems, that there's no solution to the tragedy of the commons? Well, it turns out there are solutions, and we're going to find out about them in the next lecture.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.